Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
I have three special guests today: Anjali Ramaswami, Tobias Schmid, and Miroslov Gasparek. They're all leaders of an organization called Nucleate Bio, a nonprofit educational organization that empowers the next generation of bio-entrepreneurs to launch successful life sciences ventures. Their program connects early career scientists with business students and provides a structured educational framework with one-on-one mentorship that leverages their world-class network and resources. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about the pain points this group is addressing in technology translation to startups, understand how they match co-founders, their application process, guidelines and challenges for others considering launching a chapter of Nucleate at the universities, and subjects like diversity, cross-pollination between campuses, and many others. The problems they are addressing are aligned with the mission of this podcast, and I hope Nucleate can help more spin-outs from universities around the world. And I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Anjali, Tobias, Miro, welcome to the show. A good place to start this conversation could be by talking about the origins of Nucleate Bio. Tobias, maybe you can start by setting the stage by talking about what were the pain points you're trying to solve when the program was launched.
Maybe with a little bit of background. So Nucleate is a free nonprofit organization that's dedicated to empowering the next generation of biotech leaders. We recognize that amongst academic trainees who are really eager to leverage their skills for the betterment of society using life sciences industry, there was this unmet need. There are paths outside of academia that are becoming increasingly accepted. However, these well-defined mechanisms for how to support and train students to be able to achieve those alternative career paths weren't really quite clear. Over the past 4.5 years, Nucleate has sought to fill this gap by providing accessible, high-quality programming for students to learn and engage deeply with the biotech industry.
I was doing some research on this and saw that it was started around Harvard and MIT ecosystems, which, relatively speaking, have much better resources. Why there, and what was the need to start the program around that?
What's impressive is that even in places like Boston and the Bay Area, where they have such a rich ecosystem already, there still was this gap for educational-based programs. So something that Nucleate is really important. We provide open access programming so that we can democratize biotech education. So it's not just limited within the labs and the spaces that already have access to VCs or have access to translation because they've done it before. We sought to be able to identify and educate talent across these areas. So even in Boston, there are MBA students out of the Harvard Business School who are yearning for opportunities to work with early startups. For these early academic trainees, so these are scientists, postdocs, graduate students who have an idea in their lab, but they're not quite sure where to turn next. We provide them that resource so that they have mentors. They pair up with these MBA students and clinicians so they can really address and translate their idea from a scientific proof of concept into a full-fledged pitch. In Harvard, you have this access with top advisors, people who can really provide and dedicate their time to assist the program. And then once we were able to establish there, the goal was to be able to democratize this and go across the country, across the world. We now have over 20 groups across 120 different universities across the US, UK, and EU. We realized that that was a good fledgling ground, but even in places there, Berkeley, Stanford, there's still room to improve. I think because we're totally free, we don't charge to be a part of the program, we don't take equity. This is an opportunity to take that risk within a very short 3-month compact program and advance their idea very quickly, even in places like Boston and the Bay Area.
We'll come back to the subject of MBAs. I have a lot of interest in that area. But maybe before we go forward, because you guys are from 3 different geographical regions, Anjali, maybe you can start by talking about the state of the union of the startup support system for grad students and postdocs in the biotech area, from where you come from. Maybe each of you plug in your backgrounds a bit.
First of all, thank you for having us, Naresh. Tobias hit on some really interesting points with Boston and the Bay Area and these very seasoned biotech ecosystems where inventors and entrepreneurship and investors go deep. When we expanded to areas that didn't quite have these ecosystems or were building upwards to that point, we had a new set of challenges and a new set of goals actually for those regions. I built the chapter with my colleagues at New Haven, which is a very small city. Itself contains a very small number of universities, and yet we're producing such translatable research. And we do have some biotechs and some investors in the area. But I think beyond what the activator at its core endeavors to do, which is really start companies and ventures around trainee research, we aim to go one step further, which is to build community and to build a platform, a conversation about entrepreneurship. The culture is such that people think to do this at the first sign of data that could be translatable. We hope to sort of build a culture, a community, so that 5-10 years from now, it's not just Nucleate, that's the new thing in New Haven, for example, but it's multiple other organizations that have cropped up.
Miro, maybe you can go into your background as well and talk about the state of the union with the biotech startup in the UK.
I'm Miro. I'm originally from Slovakia, currently doing my PhD in engineering and synthetic biology at the University of Oxford, and also working in semi-stealth biotech startup focused on biomanufacturing. And I'm the co-managing director, together with James Bain, of Nucleate United Kingdom. So James, we are kind of overseeing all build-up of the Nucleate from kind of the scratch in the first overseas region beyond the United States. You could say that the United Kingdom certainly has some advantages. Broadly speaking, there are some great universities, Imperial College, University of Cambridge, Oxford University, and beyond. There is some great science being done. There is comparatively, let's say, more capital than in Europe. Still, you could say that the early stage support for startups is not sufficient, especially in the biotech. What we are trying to do at the Nucleate UK is to advocate for improvement of the ecosystem, be advocates for making sure that a founder-led biotech, which I think all of us can talk more about, that a founder-led biotech is heard and is supported, and obviously trying to fulfill the mission of Nucleate, which is to help empower young biotech entrepreneurs.
Great. And Tobias, I know you're from the Bay Area. I want your perspective also, because you recently got your PhD, and I want to see from your eyes.
I received my PhD as we were launching Nucleate in the Bay Area. And it was pretty critical being able to advance my career and get into the venture capital world, which is now looking at venture creation and building companies. And starting my research, which was very basic in neuroscience, Nucleate really broadened my platform of being able to interact with the biotech industry and understand what it takes to build some of these small companies. Even just launching a new chapter in a new region is in itself somewhat of a startup. You have to think about, how do you build communications? How do you build an organization? We went from 2 or 3 people to 25 very quickly. How do you learn about passing on the information in an effective way so that you can come out and really have a large impact with very little resources? From a leadership perspective, from teams that go through our flagship activator program, from the various other educational programs that we run, the goal is to really build that ecosystem and build that community and then advance your career in whichever way you're trying to go following your education.
If I can build up on what Tobias said, each chapter being literally a startup that is pretty much scaling very fast. So just in the UK, across 3 chapters, London, Oxford, Cambridge, since beginning of 2022 till now, in 9 months, we grew from James and I, so 2 people, to more than 40 people at the moment. I would highlight other aspect, which is really talking to key stakeholders and very senior people in the biotech ecosystem in each respective region, which some of the people before could find intimidating. Like, well, I'm going to Atlas, I'm going to Syncona, I'm going to Abingworth, I'm going to investment bankers. And we are, in a good sense, often very surprised by how approachable many of these key stakeholders are and how they are willing to help support the birth of more robust structures that would support the biotech ecosystems. And I think that this is super helpful for everybody involved with the Nucleate, both on the level of like, hey, we are the team in each chapter doing this Nucleate, so we get this network, but also for each team that goes through some of our programs, which then can be connected to these key stakeholders.
Let's dive into the program itself. Anjali, maybe you can broadly define the program.
Nucleate is composed of actually many things, but just focusing in on the Activator program, which is our flagship program, it's essentially a platform for trainees and students, graduate students, postdocs, even faculty in some cases, to build ventures out of their academic research. We do this in a very defined way in which we get technology applicants, we get business applicants. Usually these are MBAs or other folks who have significant experience in the life science industry. We do some co-founder matching to build strong teams that can then go into the program. And then we spend the spring helping these teams develop a venture thesis that's formulated on a few key items, which can go from starting a venture based on a scientific concept and building that based on what experiments you might need to do in order to achieve early proof of concept. What is the timeline for that? Determining an application of all the things you can do with your technology. What should you do? All the way to more operational considerations that would come after spinning out in terms of how to raise money and what investors to prioritize, how to operationalize your company in the early days. So really all very key pillars of venture education, so to speak. And I think one thing to just highlight about this is that all it really is it's a thought exercise. It's educational. We don't change IP during the program. We don't do experiments and create new things. We don't take any equity. And so the team essentially is unchanged. And many ventures will end up incorporating and spinning out after the program, but it's not required. And some people use it as an educational experience.
So there's no pressure to form the company. Actually, it's exploration. But you also mentioned something very important about matching co-founders. What is the process you use to find those co-founders? And what have you learned from your experiences? What works?
We're in this process right now, which is really exciting, where we're sourcing applications across all regions for a technology track, a business track. We also have a clinical track, which I can talk about in a minute. But on the science side, obviously, we're very technology focused. We're sourcing predominantly students who have dissertation research on something that's really exciting. On the business side, as I mentioned, MBAs, other folks who have some experience. And then once they get into that semifinalist stage, we essentially arrange a speed dating mechanism. They pitch to each other, they meet each other, they develop good chemistry with the hypothesis that teams that develop a strong tie early on will do better, not just in the program, but as co-founders, generally speaking. And so we allow this kind of self-prioritization. And just to say that this is almost exactly how we do the mentor matching as well when we pair teams with mentors from the industry, because we want to ensure that there's good dynamics there as well.
I want to dig in a bit more on this subject. I think a third of the startups fall apart because of having bad teams. Tobias and Miro, if there's any takeaway that you've learned, mistakes to avoid, because these are so early in the team formation. What have you learned?
Now, from my own personal experience running a startup and actually experiencing something similar as you had described and in a very painful way in a previous startup, I would just say the 3 key lesson is, first of all, start company with somebody whom you really, really know. That's, I think, the golden rule, or at least somebody who is going through some kind of a screening. So the second would be get references, talk to people who know the person in a different set of contexts. And the third suggestion would be, when you are about to start a company, you should really think about it as about a marriage. I feel that running a startup as a co-founder is often like a marriage, but it's just often more difficult to divorce than a normal marriage because it's a really, really hard contractual obligation. And you should really discuss this through, make sure that roles are defined, that everybody's happy with the vision, everybody is aligned on this, and everybody is willing to build a company in a similar way, that it's not like wildly different visions. And I think if all of us were following as a co-founders and founders these three rules, this number, which I think different people quote different number, would get much lower, much less startups fall because of co-founder issues.
And I think this is something that Nucleate takes into account and has designed the program around. Scientists and MBA students, the teams that they form throughout the program, they're not signing any contracts. It's not incorporating into a company. There's no required binding union between them. I think that would be a little bit quick and short-sighted within just knowing each other for a couple of months. But the goal of the program is that the MBA students can very much help the scientists think through those market applications, think through a number of their business challenges. The scientists can help the MBA students think broadly and deeply about different science topics. And over the course of the 3.5, 4 months that they're working with us, if they do get along really well and it is a good match, they've essentially vetted each other. That's a really good way that they can see, how does each other work? Do they like the type of work that they're doing together? From there, if they do want to incorporate, they can incorporate. But many of the teams don't necessarily do incorporate. They realize, hey, we need to go back to the drawing board, do a little bit more science, or actually, this wasn't the right fit. They go their separate ways without the troubles of having to officially split it.
I really like this exercise of working together for 3 or 4 months. I think that at least builds some bonds or breaks them if they're not going to get along well.
I think this is a good point to talk more specifically about some of the programs you run. Let's start with Genesis.
Let me first say that though the Activator was our first program, one of the things that we quickly realized is that it wasn't reaching every student that we wanted to reach. We were only with that program targeting students who had translatable research that they just happened to be working on in the lab. And we only targeted business students who specifically wanted to get involved in an existing emerging venture. But there's a lot of other students that just want to learn about biotech. They want to learn the skills. Maybe they'll in the future not necessarily be entrepreneurs, but be venture capitalists. They'll be folks in business development, running pharma at senior executive level. We want to foster these skills in this vision. And so with Genesis, it's actually kind of a sister program to the Activator in the sense that rather than developing a venture thesis based on existing research, you're developing a venture thesis based on an idea. We typically recruit sophisticated PhD students who can tackle scientific problems and tease them apart into solutions that might eventually help society. We do this through kind of a formula that the folks who organized this program, PhD students at Harvard, Kevin Dong and Travis Fleming, essentially were able to curate by having conversations with venture creation focused firms like 5AM and Atlas Venture and Flagship Pioneering to really teach students the skills involved in venture creation, set them on that track, and then also teach these principles from the Activator that we wouldn't normally get out into the world. So that's Genesis. As Tobias mentioned, there's several other programs that we run and some in the pipeline as well.
I'm glad you recognize that not everybody is ready with an idea. But you mentioned something about translatable research. Who actually decides if some research is translatable? From a perspective of a grad student or a postdoc, how do they make a decision if they need to apply for your program?
Well, that's a really interesting question because it's not always the graduate student or the postdoc who will be able to recognize that their research is translatable. That's kind of where the leadership team's job comes in. We spend half the year scouting universities for technologies. We are all students, and so these people are our peers. We have an ability to discern interesting research, talk to our friends, do this all at a very grassroots level, have conversations that essentially motivate people to think about all the different applications that their research can have in the real world. It takes a village, I think. It's not just one person.
We're essentially a group of startups across all the 20 different regions, but together we actually have over 600 volunteers who are really scouring and working across different academic programs and different universities. We try to formalize some of this translation as well by coming up with programs, for instance, like our Innovation Fellowship. These are fellowships across different universities where 3 to 4 students will learn about a particular target area, a particular area of biology. It could be small molecules, biologics, diagnostics. We speak to founders that have come out in companies in those specific areas to really understand what was successful, how do you start a company in that particular area. And then they start looking across the campus for the next 3 months, putting a VC hat on and trying to identify technologies in labs, speaking to postdocs, speaking to students. And many of those students have said, I didn't even know that this could be translated. And through that conversation, they again become engaged with the biotech community. I think as scientists, you often end up being somewhat isolated in your little bubble. You know about the top few professors in your particular field. But outside of that, you don't realize that there's maybe applications for your work that could really have a broad impact on the community. So we try and do this both from a leadership and from a formal fellowship perspective as well.
There's exactly this element. Not so many of us in a Nucleate leadership work with different venture groups. Our co-founders and founders of the startups went through many different programs, and my company went through Y Combinator. We can see what is out there and what we as a Nucleate can provide unique value in. But we can't emphasize enough the community argument. I can give an example. There's a very successful early stage startup. The CEO of that startup is mentoring me. Then we can kind of pass the knowledge along this way. I think that what Tobias said and what he suggested, often the research is not recognized as translatable, is having my UK and European perspective, one of the biggest problems. I don't want to mention names. I went to one country for a lab exchange, and I saw the presentations of all the different research from that research group. And my thinking was, oh my God, this is like startup number 1, startup number 2, startup number 3, startup number 4, right presentation after presentation. They just don't think about it in this way. They think about it, this is fundamental research. Therefore, it's exciting. Therefore, it gets done and we want to do it. And this is something that we want to change and somehow say fundamental research is absolutely important and key. We need to pursue it. But if we really want to have the maximum impact, we need to bring the new diagnostic methods, drugs to the market or develop new biomanufacturing tools. Therefore, that requires commercialization. Because if it stays at your lab bench, you won't have that impact.
Absolutely. I think that is the whole thesis for my podcast. We see so much of research just dying in the valley of death in the form of a publication or a patent that nobody gives a damn about after you graduate and move on. I'm glad you guys are doing this. And at the core, looks like the biggest problem is a lack of education around the space. And you're filling a very, very important void in there. Even your fellowships look like a great opportunity. Like they need to know what to look for. And then they can go and do a good job. And I really wish this will build into a much larger program. Moving along, talk about the process. What happens from the time an application comes through? How do you pick founders that are going to go through your program? Maybe you can walk through an example of an application that came to you and got accepted, and what will they get at the other end, say 6 months?
We have 2 different tracks. We have a bio track, which addresses generally therapeutics, diagnostics, research tools. And we also have an eco track, which is food and agriculture, chemicals and energy, and consumer products, because we realize that there's a deep need in both of these areas. We break this down into about 5 different components. First is applications come in, and there's a 2-part application. We say, is this technology ready to develop within the next year or so? We want our applicants to actually have IP that could be ready to spin out. This isn't just an idea creation group. Around that, we really focus on team formation. Like Anjali had mentioned, we allow the scientists to pair up with business students and then facilitate this mutual matching. And then once those teams go through our final application process, and at this point, it's almost a mini pitch. They start out with basic scientific presentation. We say, okay, can we help them? Essentially, our 2 main rules are, have they received funding in the past? I think if there's a company that has actually incorporated and received dilutive funding, they're a little bit past where we can be most helpful. And 2, do they have IP that's ready to spin out? Other than that, our goal is just, can we help them in some way? And if they meet that, we then start building the strategy support around them. So this is key. We add venture capitalists, founders who are specific to that area, clinicians, lawyers, and really build a core nucleus around the team so that these mentors can meet weekly with the team throughout the whole program. Maybe one of the biggest benefits even from the program is that the teams start to really build out their network in a hyper-specific way. Our leadership team chooses mentors and experts who are really hand-curated and matched towards what the company needs and their particular scientific expertise. The core of our program takes place from February to May. It's 3 months of hands-on workshops and professional development meetings. During these workshops, they meet specifically one-on-one with experts. They'll have some pre-work where they essentially make some basic slides. Each workshop builds up into essentially putting together a pitch deck. We start with technical risk and scientific plan. How do you think through where your milestones need to be and when you're ready, what you can expect, what's needed for that? Then we think about the market risk and application. A key part of this that I think many young scientists are a little bit scared of is how do they present their work in a non-confidential way? We often speak with scientists who have never really thought about this. We pair them up with language training programs. So they actually learn how to tell their story, present and pitch to a broad audience, how to read their audience. And that's a key component that they learn. So these teams, they go through regulatory strategy, strategic fundraising, they meet founders, they meet different experts. And at the end, there's a practice pitch. Each region has a small competition. The teams will all present in front of a core group of judges who are really top VCs, top founders within each region. So a pretty exciting culmination to the activator program at the end of May. During this time, the teams will pitch. Some teams will receive prizes. Teams are then actually invited to a national summit that we host once a year in varying cities. It's a chance for these teams to show everything that they've put together and learn what their next steps are and get really critical feedback in a positive way. This has been really successful so far for over 108 teams. So far, these teams have raised over $170 million. Some of them really do spin out. We're just in year 4.5 now. So that number will keep growing pretty rapidly. So it's pretty impressive what a team of volunteers can do with very small resources, thanks to our sponsors. We're able to really have a big impact on the biotech community.
Of the 108 applicants that went through, how many have started the companies already? Do you have any metrics on that?
I would say from what I've gathered, at least in the Bay Area, there's about 30% of the teams spun out immediately. Another 30% are essentially finishing up another year or so of lab work and then will be ready to spin out. And another 30% probably are going back to the drawing board a little bit. But I think that number probably varies widely by region and across years as well.
Anjali, you mentioned something about the clinical track earlier. Maybe you can shed some light on that.
With bio-focused innovation, we find that sometimes scientists and business people need to contextualize what the problem that their venture is aiming to solve around real clinical problems. The folks that are best suited to address this are the doctors in the clinic doing the surgeries who can best understand the patient's needs and best understand at what point in the clinical workflow these particular innovations would make the most impact. That's really what the gap that the clinical track is aiming to fill. We recruit clinical participants in the same way that we recruit technology and business applicants. We try to pair them in ways that make the most sense. These are usually residents or fellows because we want to make sure that the clinicians that are advising the teams have sufficient experience in the clinic and can use those years of experience to help the team define over those several months how they want to grow. We also this year are hoping to set up a series of lectures for clinical track participants and actually just clinicians anywhere and everywhere to learn a little bit more about biotech. I think put some of these things in context, learn about regulation, clinical trials, all these things so that we can improve upon their learning as a group.
I'm curious to find out what the response has been from the residents. I know they're super busy with their lives. What has the reception been there and what are the challenges there?
I honestly am not the best person to answer that. I'm not running the clinical track specifically, so haven't been very close with the clinicians. But if Tobias and Miro have any insights there.
The residents really like this as well. I think, like you mentioned, they're extremely busy and they don't really have the same time that they can commit as an MBA student who's trying to start a company or these scientists who it's their baby over the last 5 years. So they're in a more refined role. They're not taking part in these weekly workshops every single week. They play very specific indication selection and thinking through that application selection. It turns out a lot of these residents do want access to be able to start new companies. Many of them are just as interested as the business students in being in a new company, but they don't quite know where do they find these new companies. They get a lot, I think, out of it in that many of them have gone on and joined part of the company. We definitely recognize that they're much busier, and so they're not playing a week-to-week active role. They have a very specific role that they play in the program.
I was just curious because I had a few physician entrepreneurs who came out to my show and talked about how they're in so much debt that they need to get a job and start paying back those things and not willing to jump into a startup. Let me go back and touch upon a subject, Tobias. You mentioned about how grad students and postdocs are usually scared of revealing the technology and they're always worried that somebody's going to scoop. How have you guys addressed that apprehension? What worked?
One is that our program is entirely non-confidential. So we don't expect that they're telling their secrets. We don't expect that they're revealing their secret sauce. Like I mentioned, we have this particular speech language program that we run with them so that they learn storytelling. In this, they have 2 meetings with professionals. They have 2 one-hour meetings where they learn how do you highlight the key components of your research and tell the story of unmet need, challenges in the ecosystem that don't necessarily have anything to do with what your particular technology are. But if you can tell the story of why your research and why the technology is important, and then explain that you have an answer to this, and then they learn how to present that in the right way, I think that's a key component that just as scientists, you're not really taught. You're either taught that once it's published or patented, then I can tell you everything. Or until that point, I don't know what's going to happen. We really see this transformation. It's one of the biggest transformations you see throughout the whole program is in the initial applications, they're very scared to tell you even what happens. You get these very basic pitch decks where they don't really say much. And at the end, they have fully fledged company looking pitches and they clearly feel very confident about how to talk about their work. So communication is a very important skill that we train throughout the program.
It's totally true that we're just not taught. As a scientist and engineer, engineers is a bit more than like pure scientists, but we are not taught like go into very, very depth of like what the problem is, but explaining this in a very approachable way, say demonstrating how large problem that we are looking at is, because often we are talking to professionals in our fields who kind of get it. They get that biomanufacturing of some drugs is a problem, or understanding the blocking of this pathway is a big problem. But we are not taught this. And I think that the Nucleate is improving this communication. I would also point out another thing. So we are trying to work closely with the tech transfer offices of the universities that we are working on. And I think this is unique when compared to many other programs. So many other programs are either like, we don't care what's going on with your university IP, or like, can you sneak out? Can you like not talk about it? Like try to hide. We don't think that this is right. What we try to do is to collaborate directly with tech transfer offices. Just to give you an example, before each chapter can launch, there needs to be a written communication trail proving that you have talked to tech transfer office and that they are aware of you and your work. And this is very helpful in getting that local support of the stakeholders. And I'll just like highlight one example from the Oxford University. We've been having an extensive talks with Oxford University Innovation. To be frank, we were a bit surprised by how constructing they were. And we are learning also how little often students know about what to do when you figure out something. For example, you want something patentable, maybe you shouldn't just throw it out to the bioarchive as soon as possible. Often what we learn is that there are well-defined policies or tech transfer policies, but they are hidden in a Statute 8, Paragraph 7, Subclause 3, Statement 4. It is not easy to get to it. It's not easy to understand it. So one of the things we're working on is like, hey, what would be an easy flowchart that people can think about and understand in terms of a very simple do's and don'ts? And I think that this is what can make Nucleate really unique, the TTO collaboration.
Maybe that's a good point to talk about. Anjali, maybe you can take this about the kind of support system and the challenges you guys are facing when you try to start a new chapter. What has the general support been? There are so many chapters, I'm guessing they've been pretty supportive.
Every city will be different. I can speak to my own and I can speak to some of the trends that I've seen across the country. As Miro mentioned, tech transfer offices have, by and large, been very, very supportive. And this is key to running the program because oftentimes these offices serve as the centers of academic innovation for every university, and being able to close the gap there not only ensures that we can operate without barriers in a given region, but it also protects our entrepreneurs. If we are helping them form the framework for their venture, when it comes time to incorporate and spin out, if we are well aligned with our tech transfer offices, then that transition point becomes seamless. The faculty to student interaction when spinning out becomes seamless. So having this support is critical, and I think it's been altogether very positive. Beyond that, local incubators like biolabs and J-labs and folks like this have also been very supportive. They operate oftentimes across multiple regions and so have very similar goals to what we might have. So we've run educational events with some of these partners, and we've run pitch events and other things at biotech workspaces and social spaces in each of these regions. And so all of these things provide flavor to each of our cities and are important for establishing Nucleate's presence in these. And in terms of challenges, I think some of the things we mentioned previously in terms of digging a little bit further for innovation, knowing that it's still there, but realizing that one may not be able to scratch the surface to find and then convince folks to translate their innovation is key and something that we think about constantly in places like New Haven.
Any observations from you, Tobias?
Adding on to what Anjali was saying, when we're launching a new chapter, one of the first things we do is landscape. What are the different stakeholders in that area? Who are the incubators? Who are the other similar programs? Who are the other accelerators who are either maybe downstream of us or even upstream of us, so that we've become complementary and become part of the filter. Our goal is that it's win-win-win with everyone. The lawyers that we work with, they get future clients. The mentors that we work with, they have future colleagues and they're able to recruit from these people. The VCs who are mentors, they're able to get deal flow. Other accelerators, they're hoping to build some of our teams so that they go into their accelerators or they go into their lab spaces afterwards. The university gets development of their IP. We find what group exists and how we complement them so that we're all aligned as we build the chapter and accelerate into different regions. And this is definitely made possible by the sponsors as well. I think there's a number of sponsors and partners who work with us on different initiatives like Genentech, Alnylam, Petrie Ventures, and Schmidt Futures. And they see the value of what we're doing. And they really hope to be able to build out that ecosystem so that it makes it possible for all of this operational programming to happen. And each region is, again, a mini startup. So we're responsible for raising funds, for finding our sponsors, for finding partnerships and running events with them. And it becomes really enriching.
Miro, any observation from UK and Europe?
In the UK, it was different because we're literally kind of tasked with starting a new country, which brings all of these challenges and some extra on the top. For example, something that we are still having an involved discussion like what legal entity structure you should have such that you can keep a national organization flexible, allow it to raise funds from the local sponsors, but allow it in the same way, just not to be totally independent, and make sure that Nucleate Global, our Nucleate headquarters, has some kind of a reasonable oversight and capability to make sure that compliance is assured and everything. So that is an extra set of challenges. And sometimes it can be very difficult. You just essentially are coming into a new ecosystem completely. I would say how the Nucleate was expanding from beyond the US is that, say, James and I were maybe very lucky to be among the first people from the UK who were able to kind of make way into like US early stage venture ecosystem through our fellowships with a Silicon Valley based venture fund in my case and in Boston based venture fund in James's case. So we kind of people from around Nucleate somehow got a insight into us and knew us. And then Nucleate was growing kind of organically. We're thinking, okay, where are the strong ecosystems in this country? Let's try to build chapters there. Just kind of quite immediate, London, Oxford, Cambridge. And we were very, very, very lucky in selecting absolutely brilliant managing directors of those chapters who then kind of were able to build the organization from below. And we're also selecting the people on the national level into the key positions. And now as we are growing, we are putting in a more and more thinking into a structure, which is much more like, hey, what are kind of the requirements? What do we want to see? Like, what are the specific positions we need? Somebody in a comms team that does exactly this or that versus like take all the smart friends that we know. We still somehow want to do that. But as the organization is growing, it's getting more and more structured. And I think that this is key to the sustainable organization. And Nucleate is doing a great job about writing a big standard operating procedures, adhering to these, building the organizational and operational structure. That's what we are doing.
Yeah, interesting to hear. The closer you are to the Bay Area, Boston, it's easier, it seems.
Interestingly, though, it's also those outside regions, the regions that aren't necessarily in the hubs, that are craving our program the most. And I think that's where we actually fill the biggest need. That was the main goal. Though we started in Boston and Bay Area and these other biotech hubs, the goal really is to be able to reach out so that we have teams from every continent, teams coming from South America, Europe, Asia, where that ecosystem doesn't exist and we can be that first linchpin to build around.
Very interesting. I was reading a tweet by an investor today morning. He was recommending that startups outside of the Bay Area should better hire a law firm in the Silicon Valley because they're more aware of everything in the venture space more than the other areas. Interesting to hear this. I can see the need of programs like this.
And I can get very passionate about this because Nucleate is equity free, student run. totally free for all the students, operationally run because of the sort of generous sponsors. And I will not name the countries and programs, but what I see is, say, in Central Europe, where I'm originally from, and I don't want to categorize, but let's say that the level of the curriculum is not as involved and the access to stakeholders is a different universe. And they will charge you a lot of money equivalent to more than a monthly salary of a lab assistant or 2 months of salary of a PhD student in that region. And to us, this seems to be unfair. We don't want to do that. We want to make innovation accessible to everyone because there's no reason why people in Kazakhstan, Armenia, in Chile, Zambia, why they couldn't go and learn about building biotech companies. We are very passionate about taking innovation beyond Boston and San Francisco.
Interesting question, an important question to ask. And maybe it's a good point to slightly shift gears and talk about something we mentioned earlier about MBAs and pairing them with PhDs. What are the components of the most successful teams that you have seen so far? Take MBAs more specifically. I know they help you with assessing market and other risks, but biotech companies usually take a long time to go to the market. What kind of MBAs have been a better fit? Because traditionally, MBA students go to management schools to take a course, it's a networking opportunity, and then advance in their careers. Who are the ones standing out in terms of actually being a part of the biotech companies? I ask this because if somebody's trying to find a partner at the Harvard School of Business or any of the business schools, what should they be looking for? How do they filter them?
What we found is that, interestingly, many of the MBA students who are applying for the program come with many years of background, working operationally in a company, working in venture, working in private capital, thinking about biotech, actually deeply in the biotech space. One of the surprising things that I learned through starting the Bay Area chapter was that there's very few MBAs in an MBA program, even at Haas and Stanford, that are biotech focused. Out of 150, 200, you might get a dozen, maybe even less. Those are the MBAs who join the program. Those are the ones who actually bring deep technical and operating experience. For instance, last year we had a PhD student from UCSF and a MBA student from Stanford. They were generating a company in women's health for in vitro fertilization to advance that. And the MBA student who joined the company had already started an in vitro fertilization company and had already spent 5 years starting that company and immediately brought technical and deep expertise that was needed for that company. And so we have other examples where there's an MBA student who's also a medical student at the same time, and they bring deep indication and application knowledge to these teams. And so we find that the MBAs, and again, because we have this self-matching process, they choose people who they say, hey, you have something that could be beneficial for me. And so they do go on, and maybe some of these scientists don't want to be the CEO. They want to focus on their science or technology. The MBA then steps into that role. And you can really see in the pitch events, different modes and different models that different teams use, whether the MBA plays a key role or a supportive role, depending on the scientists.
Looks like MBAs with the right experience seem to be a limited factor. Is there any cross-pollination happening across campuses? Are you sticking them to only one campus, or can somebody from Yale work with somebody in UK?
We do have cross-pollination, for sure. Our program is generally virtual. We have a number of in-person events, pitch events, networking events, but a lot of the workshops are virtual because we started just before the pandemic. And then over the pandemic, we were able to be just as successful, if not grow and really accelerate in different regions. We've had MBA students from Stanford match with MIT PhD students. What we often do is, if there isn't maybe a perfect match within the region where we host our interacting events, that's, I think, part of the, not even necessarily just with the MBAs matched with the PhD students, but also with the mentors, with the experts. We're able to bring experts from across the world to come and meet if they have a hyper-specific use and technical expertise. Why should Stanford be separate from Berkeley other than undergraduate football? There's sort of no reason to have that divide. Same thing, why should there be an East and a West Coast divide? It's really a little bit arbitrary. And we hope to bring this new generation of biotech leaders to say that doesn't matter. Let's just work together.
I guess you're forming diverse teams. Maybe Anjali, we talked about this concept of bringing diversity to startups. What are you guys doing beyond university diversity to support that?
The audiences that we target are often leaving probably their final tier of education to transition into their first jobs. If they're part of the activator cohorts, they might start their companies or they might go into the biotech industry otherwise. And I think we all know that the biotech industry as it is not very diverse, particularly at its senior leadership across VC, entrepreneurs especially, so on and so forth. So we feel that it's really a responsibility of ours to operate at this crucial turning point and be able to create a talent pipeline that's very diverse. And we start within the organization, generally speaking. At every tier of our leadership, we strive and I think have largely achieved 50% women and men. We strive to have a very large proportion of underrepresented minorities. It's very important for us as we choose the mentors and experts that come into the ecosystem and interface with entrepreneurs, that these are diverse as well, because we want to see that our entrepreneurs are motivated by seeing themselves in what they might become in the future. Beyond that, I think a tangible way in which we are hoping to increase diversity in entrepreneurship in biotech is that as part of our activator program, one of the workshops is specifically meant to address diversity. And so teams learn about diversity in the workplace from folks who are in charge of these initiatives in biotech companies, and they craft diversity statements and plans for what their companies will do in the future and present them at the final pitch. They're even scored as part of the final pitch on their commitment to diversity. So we want to, with every program, really just bake it into a core curriculum.
I'm going to double click on this subject because it's very, very important for me. I think there's a divide between men and women, male and female, and there's also an issue of underrepresented minorities like African Americans, like Latinos. Like historically, the number of students going into PhD programs has been low. Are there anything specific that you guys are doing or plan to do to reach out to those communities to get them in there? I'll give you an example because I talked to my guests about this. They don't want to come to the Bay Area because the cost of living is too expensive. There are not too many of their kind to network, and they feel like it's not a fun place to be. What have your observations been? And like, if there is anything you're addressing, I think it's very, very important to talk about this.
You are fundamentally addressing a pipeline issue. I think at the stage that we're at graduate schools across the country, at MBA schools, we've already selected for a population that is less diverse than it could be. There are two things that we are specifically aiming to do as part of our multiple education initiatives. We have one called Next Generation Scientists, which is aiming to provide a curriculum and infrastructure for high school students, never too early to start learning about biotech. One of the things that we plan to do in the near future is do a flip science fair where the activator teams will present their companies and their stories, along with some personal flavor of their career trajectories and why they choose to be entrepreneurs, to students at local high schools. We're starting this in Boston. We're hoping to do it across the nation as a way to engage with the community and maybe challenge the perception of what people think entrepreneurs look like. We also have a growing undergraduate program. Rather than being this venture formation focused curriculum, is really just meant to expose undergrads to biotechnology as they are choosing their next steps. More of a biotech 101 kind of thing.
Yeah, we had one startup in Colombo where basically a couple of postdocs were working on the technology with an undergrad, and an undergrad actually dropped out, became the CEO of the company running that. And it's just fun to hear the stories about the possibilities just because of whoever you are, just because you're an undergrad. It doesn't stop you from doing anything as long as you give them the right tools.
I would add to what Angela said. I really like her framing of this is a pipeline. International expansion of Nucleate is one of the best ways to address it. And we kind of started in the US, but now we expanded to UK, Israel, Switzerland. These were kind of the first pioneers. And chapters are opening up, or the nations, could say, are opening up in France, in Italy, Japan, in other countries. And I think like this is the best way. And I'm dreaming of Nucleate Zimbabwe, Nucleate Nigeria, Nucleate Russia, Nucleate China, essentially all of these places. And this is, I think, a great way. And I would add to what Angela said. We, as the leadership of Nucleate, we definitely feel the responsibility, whether we are on the venture side or on a startup side, to go around and preach and go, especially in a case of, say, as far from areas where biotech is absolutely underrepresented, like Slovakia, go talk to the stakeholders, talk to even high schoolers. Just went to a tech conference a couple of days ago. I went to the stage and said, look, here is this organization, Nucleate. It's growing globally. We are part of it. Our biotech ecosystem is in a dire state, but we are here to help expand it. And we want to do it. And it is possible. Even in Slovakia, Romania, Azerbaijan, there could be new big biotech successful company. And I think that this is a big part of what Nucleate is doing. And one important part of diversity is that we are very, very international. In the UK, I would say that most of the team is actually international students studying in the UK. Nucleate was co-founded by international students studying in the US. So it really, really matters to us.
From a pipeline perspective, like Anjali mentioned, each chapter has an outreach and a diversity initiative that they're championing. It's a core philosophy as a part of Nucleate, with 20 regions having and hosting 20 different diversity projects. You really can have a very large impact on building that pipeline and that ecosystem from a young age. It's something that we're thinking about.
I'm glad you guys are taking it head on and wish you success on that subject. Maybe that's a nice segue to talk about international students. As Miro mentioned it, it's also the case in the US. About 50 to 70% of PhD students and postdocs happen to be international. They are here on visas. And it's a huge hurdle for them to jump over and become eligible to start a company, but actually run it, raise money, you need a green card or some other visa. What has your observation been? And are you guys doing anything at Nucleate to help them transition out of the visa problems?
I think you touch upon a really big problem that as of now, Nucleate has not been able to solve. We've not been able to address how do we help these teams transition with their political status as well. In general, we don't have a bias or we don't factor that in. For us, you can be international or a domestic student, it doesn't matter. We hope to provide this broad educational platform regardless of people's background. It's definitely something that we should be able to try to advocate for and should keep incorporating, but it's not something that we've been able to address just yet.
It's a big one because they can't even apply for SBIR grant. I'm assuming the same with UK and other countries as well. They cannot apply for any national grants, something that needs to be addressed. And I think we'll continue this conversation about this issue with other players as well. Maybe that's a nice point to bring up mentorship. Miro mentioned it earlier. How are you picking up mentors? What kind of mentors are coming in? Talk about that experience.
I think we've been very strategic and fortunate to really start with who are those key mentors, who are those key experts, both from faculty, the venture landscape, the biotech landscape, within each region, who are the key linchpins. From top down, I think we have a really amazing group of mentors who started from the beginning, from George Church at Harvard to Mira Charashia at Westlake. Again, ventures, Tom Khalil at Schmidt Futures, John Maraganor, who was the president of Alnylam. We are able to really rope in and get deep involvement with these people who recognize the need and see that they're able to make a big impact by devoting some of their time to us. Once you have some of them on board, it becomes slightly easier to then loop in another group, another dozen faculty, venture experts, founders in the area. Because once the word gets spun around, it becomes really rewarding for them as well. I think we've focused on who are these key leaders. They can provide advisory and connections and leverage their network as well.
Maybe you have stories about how some of these mentors have been helping the startups. If you can share one or two stories, that'll be great because you're talking about very early stage scientists who have not much information about startups and doing whatever. Maybe you can share one or two stories about the benefits they're provided.
We have two classes of industry folks that come in to help teams. One class we call mentors. These are folks that meet with teams every week, develop a relationship over the course of, let's call it the semester, and see where they're starting and see where they're ending. These individuals usually have considerable biotech experience, of course. Maybe they've been entrepreneurs in the past and are very willing to leave the ladder down and dedicate that relatively high bandwidth cost to working with the teams week to week. On the expert side, for each individual module, let's say it's scientific planning or application and marketing, we would recruit very, very specific expertise to just sit down with the teams for an hour and pressure test their hypothesis of what the team thinks they should do in this scenario. And that's obviously a much more focused discussion. So I think that relationships and networking and this type of thing is developed over time, but we also try to leverage the pattern recognition of VCs maybe over the course of their career that they've developed. And these teams are very early stage, but we find that if the teams present in the right way, if we're giving pre-work and a pre-read, it's generally a really useful conversation. And a lot of these people, they just like to talk about the science and the potential.
You mentioned venture capitalists. They're interesting because most of this are project stage. They don't even have a company. And looks like a lot of people actually raise venture money going through the program. Are you observing any change in the landscape of like at what stage the venture capitalists are coming in? And any input on that will be helpful.
In general, we are very lucky to have this support and close relationship with many different venture capital groups that are realizing that typical model of biotech, when we put a load of money into a very senior executives quickly building a company or the venture creation in-house is great, but there are also alternatives like founder-led biotech, which Nucleate proposes is great and they want to help. There is actually a venture firm, and we are talking to other venture firms who are interested in essentially coming in and saying, you guys at Nucleate, here we give you money, pick the best teams, and you kind of tell us into which companies we should invest. And again, we as Nucleate, we don't get anything, any equity out of it. It's just like we are with the companies, we help them literally. We are wearing our VC hats and help them invest in the companies, which is, I think, a very bold initiative from these VC funds, but that works. And I would say in the countries like UK, or I don't even want to talk about Europe, where the culture is a bit different and there is a lower amount of funds that will be betting on these founders. And the second problem, there's also a big problem with funds that would be able to do big follow-on rounds. Usually you want to do that in biotech, you need to go to the US to fundraise that. And I think that we are helping to change that perception. And what is super helpful is these mentors, these very senior people like John, Peter, George, who are able to come in, and when people see them being affiliated with the Nucleate, actually sitting on a board of Nucleate, they're like, okay, this is not like a set of kids who are doing this in a spare afternoon and there's nothing going to be left next month. It's something that they wish to be affiliated with. As Tobias mentioned, this makes the penetration easier. So I think this helps a lot.
When the initial mentorship core team is formed around these science and MBA students, it's again a matching process. It's not just randomly assigned. The teams that are assigned and chosen with different VCs, because there is already a fit there within that VC's hypothesis. And I think that's been part of the reason why some of these teams have been successful, is that they're really throughout a whole 3-4 months are building that relationship, which we know is very important to being able to raise funds. And so many of the teams that have raised funds straight out or even during our program met that VC as a mentor and built that relationship, and then we're able to secure funding right at the end. It's part of our goal, but that's a win when that happens.
The last thing that I just want to mention about this, you mentioned, Naresh, the concept that these teams are very early, which they certainly are. And in many situations, these teams are not ready to raise a couple $1 million from a VC. And maybe they have, as students or postdocs, they have one more year that they can do in the lab and use either lab resources or a very small amount of seed funding to push through a few proof of concept experiments to get them to that point. But going through Nucleate will inform that journey for them and help them decide, I want to do this experiment, not that one. I want to really gun towards this application and not the other set that I was thinking about before. It's a safe space, and maybe through the relationships they've gained through the program, they can keep in touch with some of those players.
I think my observation over the years has been from what you talked about and me doing a few things at Berkeley is that relationships. You may not be ready, but I think planting that seed is important because most of them don't have a way to build relations with a venture capitalist or somebody in the industry. I think that's a big, big value that you guys are bringing to the table. I'm so glad you guys are doing that. We're coming to the end of this conversation. I wanted to see if you have a wish list of things you hope to have if this program needs to catch up all over the world or even bigger and better. Because there's a huge audience, I want to see if anybody can reach out and see if we can help you.
As Miro said before, our application is open now, and we're looking for interested students and obviously great technologies and so on and so forth to participate in the program. And then beyond that, we talked a lot about experts and mentors. Folks from the industry really give life to our curriculum. We're students. We can't do it ourselves. We find ourselves as mostly facilitators and ecosystem builders. And we really need the VCs in the industry, the former entrepreneurs, the serial entrepreneurs to come in and leave the ladder down for the next generation. I would say that's really our biggest ask. Again, as Tobias mentioned, we're a cross-regional program. So wherever is most interesting, to participate, totally open to it.
Whether you're a student or someone already in the biotech industry, if you're in one of these regions where we don't currently have a chapter, we'd love for you to reach out. We'd love to keep growing and expanding into new areas. And we have a whole operational set of white papers which help get you on board, help get everyone up to speed. And we'd love for that to happen, as well as sponsors. We're totally self-funded. We depend on the generosity of people, whether it's local, regional, or across the country, and now across the world. We'd love to have that support because that helps make some of these operations happen and really drives the program forward. And if you're interested in reaching out to us, feel free to check out our website at www.nucleate.xyz. Also, feel free to reach out to us and contact us at contact@nucleate.xyz.
Nucleate wants to be the global biotech organization that will help bring this education, but also remove barrier and help the key stakeholders to make reasonable policies and make the best decision that will support the rise of biotech innovation. So this is kind of the wish call on a broader level. So yes, we call for people, for smart mentors and for students, mentor these students to come up with ideas. Anybody can reach out to us at the places that Tobias suggested. We need this capital. We are student-led. But what we also ask, please, whoever has the money, public, private, don't be afraid of founder-led entrepreneurs. They want to do their best. And with the top mentorship, they can really change the world. And the third thing we are not mentioning enough is the infrastructure. If you look at the stats in Oxford and Cambridge or in the UK, it's not actually easy to get a lab. In many other countries, the situation is even worse. If you're a startup, even if you had a brilliant idea and funding, you couldn't stay in that country because there's no lab space. So help us bring the infrastructure. And the last thing is policies and regulations. Anjali and Tobias mentioned some of these things. The problems with the visa, the problems with other regulations. Just starting a company in some countries is a nightmare. Help us, you stakeholders. Reach out to us. We want to work with you on removing these hurdles and allowing the proliferation of biotech ecosystems all over the world.
That's an important wish list. And I will have a link to the email ID and the website in the show notes. Hey, you guys have been very patient. Thank you so much. And I think a nice place to end this conversation would be to talk about your own motivations for spending so much time and effort building this program. I know from first-hand experience that this is pretty selfless. Any startup ideas that you guys are working on that you want to share? And any asks, any plugins?
Personally, I think I was able to get a lot of benefit and see Nucleate as a platform for my own personal career development. That wasn't my intention going into it. My intention was to get experience on how startups and how venture capital works. And through that, I've really been able to leverage that into a career in venture capital. And the opportunity, whether you have an idea to launch with Nucleate, or whether you're a student or a postdoc or some sort of trainee who wants to gain access and learn a whole new field of biotech, I think Nucleate really provides that platform for you to do it. And there's so many gaps in the ecosystem. You can really fill those gaps in however you want. So I've been very fortunate through Nucleate.
As a PhD student at Yale, there's a lot of motivations. I think what Tobias said in terms of accelerating career development, developing the right skills that ultimately will be helpful to all of us as we transition into the industry are critical. And then another element is really just being excited about building infrastructure where there is none, motivating students, providing a path, and building community that we also benefit from, right? As we are in the same boat as every student that we help through this program.
I would like to share a slightly different perspective. So I've been incredibly fortunate, even before joining Nucleate, having a fantastic scientific, business, and other life science mentors who helped me a lot with dealing with the issues with our past company, with building my current stealth startup. As I was going through this, I learned that this is absolutely not something that is to be taken for granted. And when Sufyan Abulhuda, who is one of the co-founders of Nucleate, reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to help start this in the UK? I was immediately yes, because I want everybody to have this opportunity. It should not be limited. My motivation is that. So democratization of the biotechnology is the first key motivation. The second key motivation is like I'm from a small Central European country. I'm really passionate about development of its sector in biotech, and people like stakeholders for a long time didn't listen to me. After I joined the Nucleate, they are to a great extent. I think that this is something that motivates me and excites me. The Nucleate is becoming a real player as an organization to which people are paying attention to. And I think that this will get just better and better. Just meeting all the fantastic people like Anjali and Tobias in our Nucleate Summit, having a coffee or wine with everybody. It's a great community, and I encourage every person who just wants to help to join us and help build this up.
Going off of what Miro was saying, what's really exciting is that we are the future biotech leaders. And being a part of this organization, you're really building out that network of people who are going to be working with together and collaborating over the next 20, 30, 40 years. Over that long run of what biotech is, this is just the start of it for many of us. And it's really building that super strong, rigorous team from the get-go.
Great. Anjali, Miro, and Tobias, this has been a fun conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of grad students and postdocs and the scientific community will benefit from this conversation. And thank you for everything you do, you and the whole Nucleate team. Good luck with everything, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.